Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old, an anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody, it's one of the great questions in human existence, especially modern human existence, how we grow up. And it's particularly relevant today in our supposed age of anxiety, where children are struggling to grow up, perhaps even adults are struggling to grow up. My guest today has done a lot of thinking about growing up. He's an old friend. He's been on the show several times before. Matt Richtel works for the New York Times, and he has an intriguing new book out, How We Grow Up, Understanding Adolescence. He's joining us from Boulder, Colorado, where he lives. Matt, welcome back to the show. In historical terms, I know you've given some thought to this. Is adolescence a modern invention? Did the ancients or people living in medieval Europe, did they even have a concept of adolescence?
Not remotely, Andrew. I'm going to put the year about 1904. It's the year a guy named G. Stanley Hall, this sort of kooky scholar, wrote the first book about adolescence. But prior to that, you want to think about people essentially hitting puberty, going into the workforce, some years later, but not so many, getting married and having kids. There was no period between, say, puberty and adulthood in which people matriculated to the economy. And I'll just pause on this. You heard the word economy right. In many ways, this is an economic function. Adolescence is where you go from being cared for to caring for yourself. And in the old days, that happened lickety split. In a complicated economy, it takes time.
So did we invent adolescence at the beginning of the 20th century, just after we invented the concept of childhood? They're intimately bound up with one another, aren't they?
They're intimately bound up. They're a little distinctive in this respect. We started to realize that in order to participate in society, you needed to learn some things beyond what you learned in childhood. You couldn't just go into the field anymore. There had been industrialization. You might walk into a society event, if you will, in which you needed some manners or other things. And as the world got more sophisticated, we invented a time period to permit the growth physically and intellectually and socially to participate in a more complex world.
Matt, I'm guessing that the history of adolescence is bound up also in the history of the United States, in the sense that this notion of self-creation, of reinvention, of making ourselves different, is also so much bound up in the mythology and reality of the Republic. And I'm not suggesting that the idea of adolescence is an American thing, but how intimately is it bound up with turn-of-the-century American history?
Well, there are early seeds from Germany and overseas of a period in which young people appear to be going through some strife and challenges that are later adopted in the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century in the US. But you bring up a really interesting point, which is that at that time, at the 20th century, there was a real concern, Andrew, about immigrants being uncouth and uncivilized. And adolescence was seen as a period where you could be differentiated through your growth and your, in effect, evolution into a more civilized being. and that adolescence represented that period. We now, of course, understand something very different is going on. Something is going on that we didn't invent. That something has to do with physiology and neurology. But at the time, we invented this to accommodate a period of growth, partly for economic reasons and partly because the scholars wanted a more civilized, polite American society.
It's fascinating. So, in the history of 20th century America, adolescence was invented and developed, in a sense, you're suggesting, as a way of ironing out our uncouthness, perhaps making us more American, taking out our ethnicity. What was the glory? What were, Matt, and I'm guessing I know the answer to this, the glory years of adolescence as we look back? Was it the 50s, the post-war age?
Well, I would love to hear your answer to that question, because I actually would say there's been a pretty good continuum where things are much more the same over the decades than we might give them credit for. So let me just ask you, when you say the glory days, what do you have in mind, and tell me how you're defining that?
Well, when I think back at media and the way in which teenagers were portrayed as generally happy, prosperity, of course, is bound up with it. From a racial, cultural point, of course, it was very much of a white suburban adolescence. But I'm guessing that the development of the American idea of adolescence was firstly white, and secondly very much bound up with the suburbanization of culture and life.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing, and I would just add a factor to that, which is corporatization. And I get into this later in the book about how a perfect example is Elvis was essentially a corporate invention to create something new to market. It caused some strife among adults. They thought he was too almost African American, too sexualized, too rebellious. But that really appealed to young people. So in addition to the factors you've already mentioned, there's been sort of an adolescent corporate axis in which corporations have really longed to use the emerging ideas and energy of adolescence to introduce new ideas.
Yeah, and of course, I know most of the African Americans I know are not particularly keen on Presley. He was himself a racist, but he certainly sexualized adolescence, didn't he? Or was perceived to sexualize it.
The reason I bring him up in the context is you ask about the glory days, and I'll risk repeating what I said earlier, Andrew, that there is, to my mind, there's more continuity among what adolescents have gone through than maybe our historical lens would suggest to us. And because there's an idea that adolescents today are in a uniquely challenged position.
Yeah.
They're in a different position, but some of the factors that affected them, and we've begun alluding to them, that affect them today, also affected adolescents of old. And here I refer to could I take a chance here, Andrew, and just give you a kind of a slightly...
Yeah, Matt, you don't need my permission to do whatever you like. You can even take your clothes off.
I'm going to give you a definition of adolescence that, after thinking about this for years, I think is it stands the test of science, and it is more accurate and more effective at explaining what's happening today than a lot of the present narrative. And here's what adolescence is. Adolescence is a period with a purpose today of integrating the known and the unknown with a highly sensitized brain. The known is what your parents tell you. Use your fork. Don't run across the street. Read a book. This is the way to succeed. The unknown, Andrew, is what actually works in a very fast changing world. If you go back to 1900, things weren't moving as quickly. There was less to reconcile between the known and the unknown. But nonetheless, a young person had to make sense of what they were being told by their families and what they were learning in the real world. This is, in effect, a major period of information processing.
Yeah, it's fascinating. We were talking about our own kids before we went live. I think, and we'll come to this, I think, in more detail when we get to your analysis of our current moment. But a lot of this has to do with the ability to take risks. To grow up is, in itself, by definition, an act of risk-taking. You go from one thing to somewhere else, and you really have no idea where you're going. It's not a formal journey, or it's a journey without a map.
And just to underscore that the physiology speaks, and the biology and the neuroscience speaks precisely to that point, Andrew, which is that if I grow up in a home where I'm told to do X, Y, and Z, but the world's changing, so I got to go take some risk to find out, does X, Y, or Z really work? The brain of an adolescent post-puberty is highly sensitized to reward, incentivized to go take a chance. And here's the simple example I'd give. Right now, in my 50s, if you said, let's go drink 3 beers, I would think, I'm going to feel rotten tomorrow. I would be baking in a risk-reward ratio that comes from experience and tomorrow's penalties. If you say that to a 17-year-old who is wired for reward, they're thinking, that's going to feel pretty good. To heck with tomorrow.
Yeah, it's James Dean versus the man in the gray suit. And I don't want to get, I want to come back to this, Matt, but the more we talk, and I know your book really focuses on this, the issue of adolescence is very much bound up in a broader culture. So one of the crises is today, I think, and I know you and I in some ways are on the same page here, is that our society has become so deeply conservative, so fearful of change, that this is actually impacting on the idea of adolescence, which by definition is about risk-taking. So there was something different about the middle of the 20th century where parents were much more comfortable about risk-taking. They weren't necessarily all entrepreneurs, but the notion of risk-taking was more acceptable, and it was a less conservative society. Before we get to the contemporary debate, which is so interesting and important, Matt, what about the 60s? I talked about the 50s. Again, as a amateur cultural historian, what happened in the 60s? Was adolescence sexualized? Was it transformed into rebellion? I made the James Dean joke earlier. But of course, in the 50s, being an adolescent wasn't about being rebellious. And then 10 years later, everything was about rebellion. Everything was about sexual independence. That was the trauma, the excitement, the color of the age. So what happened in the 60s and why did it happen?
It's a great question, and it goes to where we are, why we are today. I want to go back and just put this in the framework. Remember, these are young people who are exploring, trying to reconcile what they've been told with what's new. If you go back, I'm going to get to the 1960s by giving some context. If you go back a couple of 100 years, a lot of that exploration of what's new, Andrew, happened in physical terrain. Remember, go west, young man? The rest of that phrase. You did it. In the rest of that phrase, as I note in the book, which is not often mentioned, is go west, young man, and grow up with your country. The exploration adolescents did was in physical space. But as we get to the 60s, a lot of the exploration is happening in the idea space, in the self space. It's happening in the identity space. So you may think of this in terms of sexual, but I see it as a strong beginning, not strong, good or bad, but a significant beginning of something that leads us to where we are today, which is all the way to what is truth, what is real, who am I? And Andrew, I want to anchor this in something else that was happening around then. As we learned more as a society, a lot of ambiguity began to rise. you had mentioned that it was like a white Christian country or a white Christian place. That was a very clear set of rules. But ambiguity meant saying, hey, there's lots of different groups of people. There's lots of different ideas. This is a really scary thing for a lot of people, which is probably why we've gotten more conservative. Change and ambiguity can often lead people to hunker down.
Yeah, and just when you talk about going west, young man, it reminds me a few weeks ago, we did a show with someone who wrote a very interesting book about Teddy Roosevelt's two sons, who struggled in the shadow of their remarkable father. So a lot of it is luck and chance. It depends who your parents are. There have always been these bullying parents who you live in the shadow of and you try and emulate. And not everyone, of course, though, has a father like Teddy Roosevelt. So there's always an element of chance, and we can't acculturize everything. I mean, everyone's experience is different. Matt, before we get to our current moment, when I think of childhood, I think of, when it comes to the philosophy of childhood, I think of the great debate between European Enlightenment thinkers like Locke and the romantic reactionaries like Rousseau, who idealized innocence. And I've always thought Rousseau is a particularly corrosive influence on both left and right in European thought. When it comes to the idea of innocence, which of course is so much bound up in childhood, we're born as these blank slates, were there always critics of adolescence who said, we shouldn't take the innocence out of the child, let's maintain it, let's keep them away from adolescence as long as possible?
I would say generally quite to the contrary, Andrew. I'm sure some people suggested that, and you see that today with the idea of don't give people a phone. But
yeah, for sure. And even in Waldorf education, and we talked about that earlier.
But I hesitate to embrace the word independence innocence, because one of the things we realized is that adolescence is bound up in puberty, and puberty is not something you can effectively stop. And when I say, I need to maybe define my terms really quickly. I mentioned earlier that adolescence is a period where you go from caring for yourself, being cared for by your family, and you transition to being able to care for yourself. The reason that's bound up with puberty is a moment in which you go from not being able to reproduce to being able to reproduce. And if you're going to reproduce effectively, it's not just having a kid, it's being able to care for yourself and that offspring. Why do I connect that to innocence? Because puberty is this, I was going to say irreversible. I think it's irreversible. I actually don't know the science on that. But it is an important demarcation point. And it's one that happens. And it's one, Andrew, that's happening much earlier than it did in 1900. I'm going to pause there because it's a different part of this conversation. But maintaining innocence, very hard. Most people were saying, let's get these young people ready for the next stage of life.
It seems, though, over the last 50 years, two things have happened, man. On the one, and they're completely the opposite, which may explain our current moment, which some people define as a crisis, others might think of as an opportunity. On the one hand, physiologically, people are growing up earlier. Puberty is something you experience at a younger age. Yeah. On the other hand, particularly today, even if you've gone physically through puberty, more and more people are living at home. It's taking longer and longer to grow up. More and more kids are actually, quote unquote, failing to grow up, living at home. I hear more and more stories of parents who have 20 or 30 something year old children, often mostly boys, but sometimes girls, living at home. So are those two things true in broad terms, scientific terms, that on the one hand, we're growing up quicker physiologically, on the other hand, mentally, it's somehow the opposite is true?
I was with you till the very end of that sentence. Let me say broadly, the first part of your premise is exactly right. Puberty is happening earlier. We don't exactly know why, but let me just give you the facts. In the year 1900, puberty started roughly around the age of 14. Now it starts around the age of 12. I go also with your construct that adolescence is artificial in a way. We invented this, but if you buy into the invention, it is also lasting longer into the early 20s. So now you've got puberty, which is this pure physical beginning, which starts earlier, and the end of adolescence, which is actually an economic phenomenon. You can't measure it by physiology. It's when you're capable of caring for yourself, and in a super complicated environment and economy, that could take a long time to prepare for.
Yeah, I spend a lot of time in airports, Matt, as you know, I'm sure you do too. And when you see some of these 70 and 80-year-olds dressing like adolescents, I wonder whether one of the contemporary phenomenons has been the universalization of adolescence. It's not just an age thing. You don't have to be 14 or 18 to be an adolescent. You can just as easily be 70 or 80. Is that just a sort of a reactionary cultural comment, or do you see that too?
I want to be really cautious here because there's two points you're bringing up that are important, but I think they're slightly different. The first I just want to ask is, was it me you saw poorly dressed in the airport?
Yeah, of course. No, you always dress perfect. You dress like an adult.
Well, there is a way in which I think adolescence is gripping us all, and it's not precisely around dress. I keep referring to this framework where we're processing the old and the new. In adolescence, that happens with a really sensitive, reward-seeking brain. But in the culture we live in right now, Andrew, with things changing very quickly, we are all of us going through adolescent moments. We are all trying to process a lot of information in a fast-changing world. If you want to know what adolescent feels like on some days, picture a day where, say, you get in a fight with your spouse, and then you have a fight with your boss, and you get a rotten night of sleep, and then the next day you pull up in your car next to somebody at a stoplight, and you think they give you a funny look, and you say, I want to fight that guy. You obviously don't want to fight that guy. That's just road rage, born of sleeplessness and trying to make sense of things. That is a kind of adolescent moment that adults go through occasionally. Adolescents can go through that often.
Yeah, it's interesting the way you present adolescence as being out of control. And when I'm talked about how people dress at airports, I think I meant the sartorial consequences. I'm less interested in the dress and more the condition that results in 70 or 80-year-olds wearing torn jeans or strange costumes. Anyway,
well, no, wait. Can I stay on that? Because it is really relevant. By virtue of us living longer, Andrew, we're in an interesting position relative to our adolescents that we are kind of competing with them economically in a way that we didn't used to. So we gave over the world to them. We died. we headed to the convalescent home. They took the jobs. They began to care for us. But as we live longer, there is a subconscious level on which we are now in an economy with people who are invested in changing the world, adolescents who want their own world. And we're trying to decide, are we keeping up? Are we competing with them? It's a really tricky environment we're in as we live longer and they begin to change the world around us.
Yeah, and again, it's paradoxical, which I think explains why it's so controversial and difficult to figure out. On the one hand, as you note, it's the adolescents or late adolescents now who are becoming, you and I both have backgrounds in tech. You used to live in the Bay Area too. Mark Zuckerberg, when he made his first million, was barely post-adolescent. He continues to look like an adolescent. There are more and more kids in AI and Silicon Valley who are making fortunes, which is impacting on older people. But then, of course, we have the crisis of adolescence, our age of anxiety. Let's go there, Matt. You're intimately familiar with the literature. Jonathan Haidt has made his name on this idea of the age of anxiety, very much bound up with technological use. does your new book, How We Grow Up, which is the result of very significant research and thought, does it share Haight's somewhat apocalyptic take on adolescence and technology?
I guess I would say not. I think that there are some very good points he makes, but I am broadly concerned about a narrative that says if we take away the phones, things are going to be okay. And I think that that comes from a deep dive into the science that I would explain like this. In the 1980s and 90s, Andrew, there was immense binge drinking among the people of my generation. There was cigarette smoking. There
More
was
than 3 beers, Matt?
Oh, Andrew, the numbers are startling. The numbers are startling how high drunk driving, injury, and death were. Early experimentation with sex, nicotine use. Why am I mentioning this as the beginning of this conversation? Something else is going on with adolescence over time that merely focusing on the cell phone does not account for. This is a period, there are all kinds of reasons people went through that prior experience, but I remind people of that so that they don't say, oh my gosh, these poor kids, there's never been anything like this.
Yeah, and it's our generation that almost seems to be getting pleasure out of that. What has changed? Just before we get to interpreting the change, is it fair to argue, Matt, that adolescents today in the 2020s, they're having much less sex, they're drinking less, they're taking fewer drugs, they're much less, I don't think you would want to call it risk-taking, but they're much less radical, if that's the right word, in their lifestyle. That's one of the things that seems to have changed with adolescence.
For one of the things we don't know, Andrew, which is really tricky here, is whether the rise of social media and computers actually has led to some of those public health changes because
but
drugs,
before we get to the analysis, is that true? Is that what is happening? Are the adolescents of the 2020s, are they having less sex? Are they drinking less?
Yes,
are they taking fewer drugs than the kids of the 80s or 90s?
Binge drinking down, drunk driving, injury, and death down, early experimentation with sex down, cigarette use down. I was just pausing on, I think you used a word that it was a little more a little more of an adjective than I used. I don't remember how you put it, but yes, as a matter of fact, what you've just said is true. It is also true that we see increases in anxiety, increases in depression, increases in suicidal ideation. I know you want to avoid the analysis for a second, but any analysis.
No, I don't. I think this is one of the hearts of the matter. I don't want to ignore it at all.
So anything that we think about has to account for all these facts, not just some of the facts. And here's the way I've come to think about it, starting with some science. Let's start with the science of how social media affects the brain. The short answer is the social media the research is in conflict. Some people use social media and they're happier. Some people use social media and they're less happy. So we've got to set that piece aside. We also understand from research I was very early involved with, a book I've done about this called The Deadly Wandering. We also understand that there's an immense effort to gain the attention of people through technology companies. There's no doubt we're in an attention economy, that your attention is very important. It's how companies make money. 2 important facts. Okay, where does that take us? We can't say that social media by itself, in and of itself, is causing people to be anxious and depressed. The research doesn't show that. We might be able to say, though, Andrew, that in an effort to gain our attention, phones, social media, the same thing we're doing right here, the same thing I do with books, the effort to gain attention is taking away some important things we know help young people. 1, sleep. 2, exercise, using their bodies. 3, in-person interaction and community interaction. These all help a brain grow up. It doesn't mean social media per se or the phone per se is causing anxiety and depression. It means that as we help young people, we've got to first establish and build into their lives the things we know that work. Does that distinction make sense?
No, absolutely. And you and I, before we went live, were talking as parents. And you noted to me that you felt that if there is a crisis today, it's perhaps less about adolescents and more about the parents of the adolescents. What is it about our generation, Matt, that is contributing to this crisis of anxiety?
I don't think we're causing it, but I think we're contributing to it. And I think of, parents, please hear this if you hear nothing else. We are the original social media. When we sit at the dinner table and tell the kids how terrible things are, how mournful things are, the fact that they're not going to get into college or they've got to do this, and this. We are the original Instagram in their lives. So before we point fingers at social media, please understand that we are part of a message that is very complicated for young people. And it's important, Andrew, because of the framework I proposed early on in this conversation about adolescence. They are taking in a ton of information. We have to think about our role as information providers in all of that.
But also something going back to the 50s and 60s, and certainly in terms of my own experience, and I think most of the people I grew up with would agree with me on this. Our parents, Matt, you and I are a relatively similar generation. Our parents didn't seem to think very much about adolescence. It was just something you went through. They ignored it in us. Our generation seems to be obsessed with the adolescent experience of their children. Now, I'm not suggesting that our generation is causing the anxiety, but the question that I don't really understand the answer to is, why were our parents so different from us?
The simple answer is that each of us in our homes, Andrew, lives in a kind of surveillance state. And
always, or just today?
Today. So the mere fact that we can see all our kids' grades all the time, the mere fact that we know where they are all the time, essentially puts an impetus on us. We feel, in effect, irresponsible if we're failing to surveil them. And I'll just add another way.
That's a really important point. You should repeat that. I'm going to use that as the headline for this conversation.
Here's where it makes such a mixed blessing of the technology, which has been so helpful in so many ways. How, as a parent, are you supposed to ignore a tool that is telling you the theoretical whereabouts, happiness, success, failure of your kid? You can put this in every arena of life. I can now watch my son play baseball live at a stadium in Atlanta over a live stream and watch his stats come in. I can see the notes from our.
And you do that, or you just can?
Both. And I have to work really hard to not say anything like "nice game" to my son, because what it does is effectively say, I am watching everything you do. And I can, just to complicate this conversation, I can make a case that part of the reason drinking and cigarette smoking and sex are down is people know we're watching all the time. This is a very, very complicated moment we're in. In the end, as I'm sure we'll get there in this conversation, but in the end, I think we've got to move to a new way of thinking about how to raise and help our kids, because we've got to consolidate the complexity of these ideas. And as I say, merely taking the phone away ain't going to do it.
Yeah. And I think one of the challenges is not thinking literally about ends. I mean, there's always, everything that happens is complicated, and whatever quote unquote end we come to will only result in new stuff. And I couldn't agree more on the surveillance stuff, Matt. I remember when I was a teenager, I would just go to Europe. I grew up in England. I would go to Europe for months on end. My parents had no way of knowing where I was. If they were lucky, I would call them once a week from a post office for about 3 minutes because the phone was expensive. I remember talking to Roger Cohen, the New York Times, your colleague, and I'm not sure if he's still on the Times. He told me when he was growing up, he drove from London to Iran or Afghanistan, and his parents didn't even know where he was. And I think that is one of the more corrosive elements in technology. It's not so much, it's putting these highly surveillant tools in the hands of parents. We've all become Jeremy Benthams.
But just in your phrasing there, it's very interesting. You say, put in our hands. We've got to start taking some responsibility for how we are behaving as parents.
Oh, I agree. I'm not suggesting that everyone behaves. I mean, I try not to be too surveillant with my kids, and I'm sure you don't. You do too. But I take that point.
I do, but this is part of the real conversation we're having right now. What we're really moving toward is understand what's happening with young people and us so that we can be in a healthier space. And what we've done up to this point is essentially blame media companies. And
yeah,
on some level, Andrew, that may be entirely fair, but it's also unrealistic. It's unrealistic to think we're going back to a time where there will be fewer surveillance tools, where ideas won't move as quickly, where our attention won't be snagged at. So the question is, if that's the world we live in, and this is how the adolescent brain works, what do we do about it so we're all saner and happy?
Yeah, and it's all, you and I both have tech backgrounds. It's the easiest thing in the world, especially these days, to blame everything on Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk. So is your message partly to parents, and this tends to be still, I think, a middle class or an upper middle class message, back off, put the phone down, stop obsessing over what your kids are doing, let them do what they want?
I think I say at the beginning of this book, I have three kind of glib statements. Love, lead, and let go. Love, unconditional love. Let them feel safe. And that has to do with the points you make. Sorry, can you excuse me 1 second, Andrew?
Yeah, I'm going to let you go. I'm going to love, lead, and let you go. For people who are wondering what's going on, I think Matt's gone to tell his children off. I'm not sure what's happening. Matt, I was telling our viewers and listeners that you were probably telling off your kids.
I can't use the phrase I used. Okay.
You can't use what phrase?
The phrase I just said to my son.
Oh, you mean publicly?
I cannot publicly use the phrase, but he's got 5 friends over. He was told that I'm on with you right now and to please keep it down. And they have been writing some music with their digital audio something and decided to play it at 11. And I responded, as you might expect. But it goes just to the very point we're talking about.
But it goes to the point of you should let go. Love, lead, and let go, except that he's going to have friends over. They're going to make a lot of noise, and that's just the nature of things.
No, that's why I have to define these terms. Love, unconditional love. Lead, this is really important for this day and age. We have got to let them know that the world is not giving them things. We have to be clear with them about how you behave and treat people and what to expect, because once they leave our coddled homes, should they be so fortunate to be in one, it is hard out there. And that's why what I mean by let go. Let go means they are not us. Sometimes they will be really frustrated with us, Andrew. It's okay. We're not there to be their friends. We're supposed to guide them, but also let go in that if my son goes on to achieve the baseball success that he's started with, that's not my life. That's not mine to live from and off of. I don't need to surveil his success to feel good about myself, because that is complicating the intellectual, emotional, and information processing journey he's going on that belongs to him.
Yeah, and I've got friends who are provosts at universities who tell me stories about parents showing up with their kids and living with them in their dorm rooms and writing to faculty if they get a bad grade, complaining, saying that they're going to sue them. So it's a broad cultural problem. It's not true of everyone, but it's certainly, these aren't unusual stories, are they?
No, and they're not unusual, but let's go back to that surveillance point. It's very hard as a parent when you're getting a score of your kid every day not to keep track. And that is where we have got to take some of the pressure off them by virtue of following everything they do. Let's not be our own internal surveillance state. They need some room.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That's one thing I'm not guilty of. I never even knew how to figure out my kids' grades. But I wonder whether there are all these paradoxes, Matt, is that parents are more and more obsessed with their kids' academic success, where they go to college. In an age of AI where the whole point of education now is coming under threat, it's harder and harder to have a career. As you said, you've got to invent and reinvent yourself perpetually. And perhaps in some ways, education might be a detraction from that rather than a benefit. So it's another piece of our complex age, isn't it?
Yeah, yes, but I'm not going to call that a paradox in this respect. It depends how we define the term education. What I think is vital for young people is the following things. If you could teach your kid curiosity and you could teach your kid to think in a broad sense, they will be able to accommodate a fast changing world. Everyone says, what about AI? What about this? You and I, Andrew, cannot possibly predict what's coming next. We need to teach our kids to be less conservative in their thinking. I'm not talking about partisanship, less rigid in their thinking, because what we know is certain is change, and adolescents are change agents. They've got to be prepared for it.
Yeah, and they're, in a sense, victims. But we got to be careful with that V word, victims. I know you got to go in a second. You got to go and beat your son up, Matt. But a couple more questions. My daughter, as I mentioned to you earlier, my daughter went to a Waldorf school in the North Bay, just north of San Francisco. And she told me that on, I think it was a Friday, maybe at 2, they were allowed to leave the class if they were having therapy. And literally 95% of the kids were in therapy. Now, that's a Waldorf school and that's Northern California. But I wonder how therapeutic culture is playing out in this. Is it a consequence, a cause? What's your analysis of the almost universalization of therapy in our age? Anytime there's a problem, you're supposed to go to therapy.
Well, this is, again, super complicated, but I'll say this. One of the things we don't know about the rise of anxiety and depression is whether part of the numbers are because we're diagnosing it more. And probably the biggest example of this is the changing criteria for diagnosing ADHD, which has become more liberalized. We just don't know if it's being diagnosed more. But let's just take it on face that young people are struggling with an earlier puberty in an information age where things are moving quickly and it's hard to process all this stuff. I would like to change the word therapy in the way we approach this situation and say what will probably help young people is if if society gives them somebody or someone other than their parents to talk to, not about Freudian stuff, not even in the sense of therapy, but in the sense of working through a very complex environment. I told you earlier that, say, in the 60s, we began to look internally for exploration. One of the most fascinating things we understand today in the numbers is that what ails young people in pediatric offices has shifted from the physical to the emotional and mental. You used to come in with broken bones, and now you come in with some anxiety. Whether or not we're over pathologizing it is beside the point. The point is that one of the things we could do as society is recognize that change and put into place conversations for young people, places for them to go, counselors to have, not in the sense of a pathologized therapeutic experience, but simply in the sense of recognizing that there's a lot of internal exploration happening in this era that is very natural, and it's therefore natural that we would address it.
Final question, Matt, and there's so much more to talk about. I have to get you actually back on the show. We could do 2 shows out of this. What about the politics of all this? The traditional conservative approach, I'm guessing, would be that the 60s, to quote Philip Larkin, the British poet, fucked up kids, and we spent the last 60 years trying to fix that. But conservatism seems much stronger, certainly amongst young people, and much more dynamic than progressivism, which is in crisis. I wonder whether the crisis in the family, the crisis of thinking about adolescence and how to grow up, is part of a broader political crisis of the left. And if we can begin to figure out how to grow up, or how to grow up from growing up, we can begin to develop progressive ideologies, viable progressive ideologies for the 21st century. Does that make any sense?
Anchor this in. As a New York Times reporter, I just do not fiddle in politics. I like Bob Dylan's phrase, I don't see left and right, I see up and down. But I will say this, and it relates. I get into this book, into a chapter about how we've seen a fall in religious participation. I take no positive or negative in that. I just give it to you as a scientific matter. And the significance of it is, as the world has gotten more complicated, things that we took as plain spoken truths or belief systems have shifted. And that has created more ambiguity, Andrew. And some people have responded to that ambiguity by clamping down and hoping for a simpler time. And others have tried to figure out how we adapt to change. And both those things seem unresolved at the moment. It's hard to imagine we're going to go back to a simpler time, but we don't yet have a framework for dealing with the complexity and speed of our age. This book is an effort to at least help parents understand how to get your kids to adapt, how they adapt, and to make them saner and happier in a very fast-moving world.
Yeah, and it's called How We Grow Up, Understanding Adolescence, from an old friend of the show, Matt Richtel, who is a Pulitzer Prize winner, also the author of An Elegant Defense. I think, Matt, what you're saying, and in very simple terms, is don't worry about your kids getting rid of their phones. Maybe our generation should get rid of the phones, and then we'll be fine.
Look in the mirror, then start, breaking glass houses or something to mix the metaphors.
Well, I'm going to let you go, Matt. You can go and break some glasses with your son. Enjoy the rest of the evening in Boulder. Great to talk. We'll do it again in the not too distant future. Congratulations on the book. Thank you so much.
Andrew, it's great to see you again. Thank you.